this is Anna, and I'm going to talk about part 8 of our muscular system. We're going to focus in on energy and oxygen. All right, so we're focusing in on the muscle metabolism. So metabolism, if you remember from other lectures and courses, this is all about the chemical reactions in your body, all of them, okay, when you put them all together, okay? So when we're talking about muscle metabolism in this particular instance, we're specifically focusing on how do we get energy, and even more specifically, ATP energy or chemical energy, okay? Now, a muscle does not have a lot of ATP storage within its cells. Okay, so you need to be able to generate it. So if in terms of storage, it's only got about 5 seconds. Okay, so to generate ATP, now this should totally be reviewed from your other biology courses. You've got basically 3 pathways. Okay, you've got the creatine phosphate pathway, and I'm writing them now in like order of how quickly they can make ATP, and also in inverse order on how much ATP they make. All right, so you've got creatine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. All right, next slide. All right, what we're going to do next is I have really simplified what I need you to remember about these 3 different pathways. There's a lot more information or a lot more stuff that you studied when you took basic biology, but this is what I need you to know. All right, so creatine phosphate, my abbreviation is going to be CP. This is also called the phosphogene system, okay? Now, creatine phosphate, this particular chemical is stored at high quantities within the cell. Now, I want you to look at this. I've got a P and I've got a di-P. So this is 1 phosphate, this is 2 phosphates. If you put those together, you get 3 phosphates. So if I combine creatine phosphate with adenosine diphosphate, I get adenosine triphosphate, okay? And that's what they're showing you over here in this picture, is they're merging CP with ADP. And when you do that, you break away the creatine, because this is going over here and this is going over here, and you get your ATP energy. Now, you have a lot of creatine phosphate stored, but you use it really fast. So you've only got like 15 seconds worth of ATP that you can make using this pathway. So used up quickly, but it is replenished quickly. So you're going to use this for activities that are short-lived, okay? Things to remember: no oxygen, okay? And only 1 ATP is made per creatine phosphate, so you don't get a whole lot. Next slide. All right, let's look at anaerobic glycolysis. So this is where you are going to either convert glucose or glycogen into ATP. You will get a little bit more ATP than you would with creatine phosphate, and you get 2-pyruvate as a byproduct, okay? Again, it does not use an oxygen. It does make more ATP, and it's 2.5 times faster than aerobic respiration, but you do run out of it pretty quickly. So you've only got about 30 to 40 seconds worth of energy. So it's using glucose, and remember, in muscle cells, we can store glucose in chains that we call glycogen, okay? So you're gonna break down, and be very, very happy I've taken out all the steps, okay, with using this picture. You're gonna break down the glucose, all right? You're gonna go through the glycolytic pathway. You're gonna get 2 ATP, and you're gonna get the byproduct of pyruvate, and you're good. Again, no oxygen. All right, next slide. All right, let's look at aerobic respiration. This is the bulk of your ATP is produced through aerobic respiration. You're going to be doing this in the mitochondria, whereas creatine phosphate and anaerobic glycolysis were occurring in the cytosol, okay? It needs both glucose and oxygen. All right, so glucose and oxygen, you're gonna use both of those, all right? And what you're gonna get as byproducts are water and carbon dioxide and a lot of ATP, all right? Now this, because it has so many steps, it's very, very slow, okay? Plus, it has to have a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients. So you can use it for long endurance activities, many, many hours, as long as it's not going too fast. So over here, we've taken out most of the steps. It's showing you glucose. So basically right here, you actually do glycolysis as part of the step, all right? That's that whole Krebs cycle thingy that you wanted to forget about, but I just mentioned it so you can't. So you get the glucose, you get the pyruvate, and then the pyruvate is gonna go to your mitochondria right here, and you're gonna use some other stuff, and it's gonna send out carbon dioxide, water, and 32 net gain of ATP. All right, next slide. All right, let's briefly talk about muscle fatigue. All right, muscle fatigue is not well understood. All right, we've got some hypotheses, we've got some basic understandings of how it works, okay? And it seems like muscle fatigue is caused by slightly different factors when you're looking at moderate exercise versus long-term exercise versus short-term exercise, okay? It seems like with moderate, you're looking at ion balances going down, okay? So you're running out of calcium, potassium, magnesium, something like that. And when you don't have those ions, you can't do your excitation coupling correctly, okay? Whereas with long term, the research is showing that it seems to be more of a loss of potassium. So it's lost from inside the cell and it starts to accumulate outside the cell. Without the potassium, then you have problems with releasing the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We really haven't gone over that role so much, so you're just gonna have to believe me. And then with short-term exercise, it seems to be the accumulation of phosphates. And so they're gonna accumulate and they basically interfere with the sarcoplasmic reticulum's ability to release calcium, all right? So slightly different things, although all kind of related, all right? What ultimately happens with all of these is they're going to, that's supposed to be an arrow, okay? They basically lead to your contractions becoming less efficient, okay? And eventually you can literally not have the resources at all to do any muscle contractions, all right? Like marathoners, that can happen too. Okay, now in contrast, okay, when you die, you're not going to make any more ATP energy, okay? I want you to remember that you need ATP to break the cross-bridge attachments. So the myosin head will not release the actin until you put an ATP molecule on it. So those cross bridges don't detach. What this is going to lead to, so let's see, so one, cross bridges won't detach. All right, when that happens, remember that you're dead and you basically are no longer running the pumps in your cells that keep your calcium levels in the right balance. So basically, your calcium levels go up inside the cell. And that is going to lead to basically 100% cross-bridge attachments, because remember, the calcium causes the troponin to move, moving the tropomyosin, allowing the sliding filament mechanism to happen. So basically you get a 100% contraction, okay? Without ATP, all right, the cross bridges don't detach. So basically you have a massive muscle spasm that will not release. And this creates the situation called rigor mortis. Now, after a couple of hours, rigor mortis passes, and this is because you're rotting. Okay? As you rot, proteins break down, and that includes the myosin attachments. All right? So those basically break, and then you don't have the massive muscle spasm anymore. Okay? All right, next slide. Okay, back in the day, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption was also known as the oxygen. Oh God, why can't I write? Oxygen debt. All right, so EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, colloquially known now as oxygen debt. Basically, what this is describing is how when you exercise, so when you exercise, you're going to use up oxygen that's stored in myoglobin. Okay, you're also going to use up ATP, you're going to use up creatine phosphate, so everything gets low. So you need to replenish these things, okay, once you start to not use up that stuff. Okay, so you're going to replenish the glycogen, you're going to replenish the ATP, creatine phosphate, the oxygen, okay, and everything basically starts to go back to normal. But the critical part here, the key, is going to be oxygen. Okay, for all of this thing, you need oxygen to be present. Okay, and you've used up the store of oxygen in the myoglobin, and so you're going to have to get it from the blood circulation as it's going around the body. Okay, so excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, so post-exercise, is describing how you need a few minutes or longer, I'm just randomly throwing out numbers, to rebuild oxygen levels in muscle tissue. Okay. All right. Let's actually just start looking at some pictures. I think it'll make more sense. All right, so while you're exercising, you're using up oxygen faster than you're breathing it. Okay, so you got to breathe harder. All right, so then you start increasing your respiratory rate in order to increase the amount of oxygen that you can bring into the body. Okay, so I want you to look at this graph right here. Over here we've got oxygen consumption. Over here we have time. Okay, so we're going to show this on a little graph, and we're showing you at rest right here. So resting oxygen consumption levels, you're going to start exercising. And what you're going to notice is that very quickly you get to a point in this curve where this is how much oxygen you're producing, you're bringing in, and this is how much oxygen you would ideally have. So this area right here is considered the oxygen deficit. All right, so here you're now breathing much harder in order to bring in, so basically you've got a period where you have to start breathing harder, you've got a deficit. Up here you're breathing as hard as you can, and you're basically just kind of barely keeping up, okay, with the amount of oxygen your body needs. Then you end the exercise. So this oxygen here was just keeping things going, but it wasn't building up a storage level of oxygen in the body. So when you end the exercise, you've got this period of time right here, which is the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, where you're going to continue to breathe hard as you basically try to supersaturate your blood with oxygen so that the oxygen moves into your muscle cells and rebuilds the myoglobin storage, okay? Right in here, okay? Once you have rebuilt that, then your respiratory rate goes down and you're at your recovery period, okay? All right, next slide. All right, so we've talked before about needing things to make it easy and fast for you to study, okay? So this is one of my tools for fast study. I'm going to kind of move this over here. And I want you to be thinking about chicken and turkeys. And I want you to think about white meat and dark meat, okay? So white meat is lower in color, less color in it, less pink. It's less oily. Dark meat is more oily. It's got a darker color to it. Now I want you to think about what you're doing with those activities, what you're doing with those parts of the body, okay? So I want you to think about turkeys, okay? And I want you to think about what turkeys do. Turkeys run around, okay? And they can fly, but short distances. They're not migrating to Florida, okay? They're going to basically do a really fast sprint from the ground into a tree to get away from a coyote. So they spend most of their time walking around. So when you think about what they're doing with their muscles, their leg muscles are really going to be dependent on aerobic respiration, whereas their chest muscles are really going to be dependent on being able to hit the creatine, phosphate, and the anaerobic glycolysis in order to do the fastest sprint as possible to get away from that coyote. So we can think about these then in terms of oxidative patterns, okay? So slow oxidative and fast oxidative are both going to use aerobic respiration, okay? So you can see right here. Whereas fast glycolytic is going to use anaerobic glycolysis and creatine phosphate, okay? And if you remember how they work, this is fast, aerobic is slow, and it'd probably be better to think of this as kind of in the middle, okay? Now, what does aerobic respiration need? It needs sugar, it needs glucose, and it needs oxygen. Those things are stored here, all right? So you got glucose here, and you got oxygen over here. So, these really depend on having a good supply of oxygen. The glucose you can get through your blood supply. You don't need huge amounts of storage, okay? But aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration right here, it has high glycogen stores because it needs a ready supply of glucose immediate in order to do the, not necessarily the creatine phosphate, but the anaerobic glycolysis. But it doesn't need oxygen storage to be high because it's not using aerobic respiration, okay? Now, I want you to remember the color of myoglobin. Myoglobin is a reddish color. So you can come down here. If you have a lot of myoglobin, you've got really red. If it's kind of in the middle, it's red to pink. If you don't have a lot of it, you've got white. So this is your white meat, and this is your dark meat, okay? Also, you can take this to the next step. If you're doing aerobic respiration, you need lots of mitochondria, but if you're doing anaerobic, you don't need a lot of mitochondria. Also, if you're doing aerobic respiration, you need to replenish your oxygen supplies. So you've got a lot of capillaries, and capillaries are red, and so that helps to enhance that red color. But if you're doing anaerobic glycolysis, you don't have as many capillaries, so your meat is going to be a lighter color. And then right here we have the function of these things. So when we start thinking about it, all right, we've got a turkey who is going to have this on its legs and that on its chest. But think about ducks. Ducks migrate, but they don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time walking around. I mean, they paddle a little bit, but they're not having to do high endurance walking like turkeys are. So ducks have dark meat on their chest because they need to be doing aerobic respiration as they fly south. And they also have dark meat on their legs because they're just paddling around the water and they're not sprinting anywhere. Okay? All right, let's look at the next slide. All right, let's just talk about velocity and duration, okay, of these muscle contractions. So I got three major components. I've got muscle fiber type, okay? I have load, and I've got recruitment, okay? And this is kind of a review of some of the other things we've looked at. It kind of makes sense the way this is working. So with the muscle fiber types, you're talking about that white meat and the dark meat. So slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. All right, the load is what needs to be moved. If it's heavy, it's gonna be harder to do the contraction. If it's lighter, it's gonna be easier, and so you'll have an easier time with velocity and duration. And if you've got something that's heavier, all right, so all of these things are kind of going together, the heavier things need to have more recruitment of motor units in order to maintain the velocity, in order to maintain the duration. If you've got something that's a low load, then you'll be able to maintain duration of the contraction for a lot longer, okay? So all of these things are interrelated. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide. All I would really want to say is it's interesting because they're showing you the way they're breaking it down. So you've got creatine phosphate right here. You've got creatine phosphate plus anaerobic glycolysis right here. This is pretty much all anaerobic glycolysis. And then this can be, it starts with anaerobic glycolysis and then it ends with aerobic. Whoops, I brought this down too far. And then this one is just aerobic. And so what you're seeing is things that are the first few seconds, like a dash, a jump, a dive, or relying primarily on creatine phosphate. In this section right here, it starts with creatine phosphate and then it pretty much moves into anaerobic glycolysis. If the anaerobic glycolysis needs to take a little bit longer, then for those types of activities, then you can do that as well. But basically, you're going to start with creatine phosphate and then move into anaerobic glycolysis. And then you can do the same thing where it starts with anaerobic glycolysis. So like if you're going to be swimming 200 meters or something, you know, the first lap will be basically this. But then you've got to move into this because you don't have enough ATP energy, okay? And then long distance endurance sort of things are going to focus on aerobic respiration. All right, next slide. All right, so first let's start off with some definitions. And this is, you want to be familiar with these concepts of hypertrophy versus hyperplasia because you're going to hit it again in A&P2 and in patho. And basically, hypertrophy increases cell size, whereas hyperplasia increases the number of cells, okay? With muscles, usually when we're talking about muscle mass getting bigger, we're talking about hypertrophy. And this can be both normal or pathological. Oops. All right, so when you work out, all right, you are going to do a normal form of this. So basically what you do is you increase the diameter of each cell which is then going to increase the number of myofibrils and the other supporting organelles as well. So basically you increase all of that. Every once in a while, you get a split of the cells, and that'll make two cells, but it's not very common, okay? The pathological, probably the best example of this that you're eventually going to study in A&P2 is the heart. So when people have chronic high blood pressure, the overall size of their heart, so your heart should be about the size of your fist, and I've seen hearts that are the size of 4 fists put together with someone who has congestive heart failure. So basically the heart gets over-exercised from the increased blood pressure, and the cardiac muscle cells hypertrophy and get larger. Okay, so that's a good example of a pathological case. Okay, another thing that can happen with this stuff is you can convert between ratios of white fibers versus red fibers. Okay, so basically you're looking at the aerobic slow or fast oxidative fibers to the slow glycolytic fibers. And this whole thing right here is caused by the type of exercise. So basically, due to genetics, people are born with a certain ratio. Most people are kind of around 50-50. Some people genetically might have a slightly, like, they might be 55-45, you know, in their ratios of dark fibers versus white fibers. But with training, you can change it. So you get someone who's a marathon runner, and they were born, and if you looked at them when they were 5, they would have had about 50-50 oxidative fibers versus glycolytic fibers. But because of their hours of running, they have actually changed the ratio, and now they might have 70% oxidative fibers versus glycolytic fibers. Okay, so that's a possibility with athletes. Doesn't really happen with normal people, but with athletes that can happen. Okay, all right, that was it for part 8, and I'm going to stop the recording.